Stephen Pinker, thank you so much for coming on our programme. Let me start with a very specific question about our situation here in Britain. Our Prime Minister, as you know, is in intensive care in hospital, fighting for his life against this virus. What do you think that does to the morale, to the psychology of our nation?
It would certainly make the pandemic real. People take risks seriously when they can think of concrete examples. Statistics generally don't make risks real to people, but if there's an example that comes to mind, then they know it's serious. If an accident has happened to a friend, they take that kind of accident seriously, whether it's a bike accident, a shark attack, a car accident, cancer. And so having such a salient public figure being visibly stricken means that people will certainly take it seriously.
And yet we're obsessed with these statistics, aren't we? We're glued to these daily numbers of, mortality and the numbers of infections. And then, of course, the armory of this so-called war, the numbers of ventilators and ICU beds. What is it about our human nature that makes us want to count this crisis?
I think we might have the opposite problem, that we don't count enough. It is human intuition is really driven more by narratives, by images, by anecdotes, by salient examples. And most public health officials wring their hands over the fact that people are not sufficiently attentive to numbers. Only when it happens to someone they know do they take it seriously. Is smoking a health hazard? People can consume all the statistics they want, but if they know someone who has been stricken by lung cancer, then they start to wake up.
And obviously we all know the Prime Minister, but we may not know that many people in our own personal circle of friends. So are you saying that just by looking at the numbers, which are pretty alarming in their own right, that is not enough to make us behave in the kind of way that we should behave in order to make these infections become less prevalent?
That is right. Now, of course, a public figure like the Prime Minister psychologically feels like one of our acquaintances, even if we have never literally set eyes on him. But celebrities and politicians and athletes and singers feel like our friends, which is why people are so morbidly curious to consume gossip about them. It's not as if they're ever going to encounter them in their walk of life, but the media presence makes them feel as if they're in our circle of acquaintances.
Now, you're perhaps one of the most famously optimistic public intellectuals. You're a glass half full kind of guy, as opposed to half empty. Tell us something in this crisis to cheer us up.
Well, as much as I would like to cheer people up, and I would, I actually don't consider myself an optimist in the sense of seeing the glass as half full, but rather of calling attention to water in the glass that people aren't even aware of. So in my books, where I plot graphs on the declines of violence and of illiteracy and poverty, and indeed of disease, these are facts that people aren't aware of. It's not a question of putting a happy face on ambiguous facts. But surveys have shown that most people are completely unaware that extreme poverty has declined by 90%, or deaths in warfare have come down by 95%. They just don't know about these facts. So it's not a question of optimism, and I would not want to say, relax, everything will turn out well. I think they will if we take the appropriate measures. And in looking at the progress that we have enjoyed, it's important not to think that there's just some natural arc of history that carries us ever upward, that good things happen, that the universe contains a force that makes people better off. Quite the opposite. The universe doesn't care about us. It's trying to grind us down. Disease being a prime example. We are sitting ducks for germs. We always have been. It's in the nature of life. We are big, yummy hunks of food from the eyes of a virus or a bacterium. And it's to be expected that they will evolve ways of finagling their way into us and consuming us from the inside. Now, of course, we fight back. We have an immune system, but we also have ingenuity. We can invent vaccines and drugs and public health measures. And to the extent that there has been progress, as there has been with other infectious diseases, we eradicated smallpox, we've reduced the death rate from malaria and diarrhea and HIV/AIDS, but not because progress happens, not because we ought to be optimistic about the natural course of events, but because when people do apply ingenuity to combating human scourges, they can every once in a while succeed, as we have with other infectious diseases. And there is, of course, reason to believe that this won't wipe out humanity. We are implementing public health measures like disinfection and social distancing that have started to bend the curve, particularly in the some of the most afflicted countries like China, but also ones that have taken even more stringent measures, such as New Zealand and South Korea. There will be more tragedy, there will be more suffering, but if we apply what we know will work, then there's every reason to believe that we will tame this, that we will combat it as we have with other diseases.
So where we stand at the moment, Steven Pinker, do you think that this COVID-19 crisis is a reminder of our human limitations or our abilities?
Both. It's the limitations of being a living organism. There does not exist a species that is not vulnerable to pathogens and parasites. And we are unique in having not just our immune system, but also our rationality, our science, our public health establishment. So we have one extra weapon compared to every other organism. That doesn't mean we're invulnerable, as we see in the ongoing tragedy, but it does mean that we have weapons to fight back.
There's an awful lot of emphasis on social distancing and self-isolation. Is there a danger, Steven Pinker, in all this, that countries are now self-isolating, that any sort of global cooperation that people had hoped for is just not there?
I think that's a tide that can't be turned back. There are tourists, there are students, there are people seeking opportunities elsewhere. There are people with relatives in other countries, which means pretty much all of us. There's trade. There's just no way that we are going to return to mutually isolated fortresses. And so we're going to have to develop the means to minimize the risks of spreading pandemics with better early warning networks, better cooperation among countries, because even though it seems now as if nothing will ever be the same, because we are in the midst of the worst of it, but when the curve is bent, when the pandemic has wreaked its toll and life returns to normal, all of the forces that made us connected in the first place aren't going to go away. If we're wise, we will deal with them better. We'll have better emergency response systems in place. We'll have better networks of monitoring, better cooperation among public health networks worldwide. But I don't see us reversing the tidal wave of globalization.
This virus is a great leveler. It doesn't care about boundaries or political parties or rich and poor or religion for that matter. Do you think that once this is over, it will have changed the world, and in positive ways or negative ways?
I think we're apt to overestimate how much it will change the world. That once we deal with it, people sadly often have short memories. That all of the rest of life will continue to function in the way that it has. There will be changes. I hope there will be healthy changes, such as greater awareness of the constant threat of epidemics and pandemics, greater trust in legitimate expertise and knowledge. But as with the wake of 9/11, where everyone was predicting life will never be the same, that everything will change, that we'll never have big sports gatherings and corporations won't have headquarters in a single building, and it'll be the death of irony. When we're in the thick of a crisis, punditry goes into overdrive, and we imagine that the disruption that we are currently facing now will be permanent, but there's a massive tendency to slip back into life as normal, and I think that will be the overwhelming tendency.